Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place dedicated to taking a complex stack of sources and distilling them into the precise, potent knowledge you need to be thoroughly well-informed.
Today, we're undertaking one of the most polarizing and, frankly, complex figures of the 20th century, General Augusto Pinochet.
Right. His name represents such a painful paradox in history. On one hand, you have the architect of this brutal, repressive state.
And on the other, the leader who oversaw one of the most radical, influential experiments in free market economics the world has ever seen.
We have a fascinating and, I have to say, a disturbing set of sources before us today. We are looking at a 17-year rule in Chile, spanning from 1973 all the way to 1990.
And that period is defined by, well, a swift and incredibly violent military coup, this intense shock therapy economic policy.
Profound human rights abuses, and then, later in his life, this unbelievable series of international legal battles that just kept going.
The sheer longevity of his dictatorship, I mean, it was the longest of any Chilean ruler. That alone guaranteed that he permanently reshaped the nation's political, social, and economic DNA. He is absolutely a figure of extremes.
And his legacy remains, hotly contested to this day.
Oh, absolutely.
So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack these contradictory layers for you. We'll trace his unexpected rise from what seemed like a pretty opportunistic military officer to the head of a totalitarian state.
And we'll analyze how state terror was used not just for political suppression, but as really the necessary foundation for that radical economic change. You couldn't have one without the other.
Exactly. And we'll track the almost cinematic details of his post-dictatorship legal struggles. This is where you find a man obsessed with military history, secretly hoarding a private library of over 55,000 books.
Which is just incredible.
Isn't it? Yet he ends up being indicted not for murder, but for tax fraud and embezzlement.
It's a study in how power, ideology, and sheer opportunism can combine to redefine an entire nation. And I think how accountability, when it's finally pursued, can come from the most surprising angles. So let's jump into the material.
Okay, let's unpack Pinochet's beginnings. Let's try to understand the character of the man before he became the dictator. He was born Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte in Valparaiso in 1915.
His heritage was rooted in French, Breton, and Basque ancestry. He entered the military school in Santiago in 1931 and graduated in 1935 as a second lieutenant in the infantry.
And if you look at his early military records, they're frankly underwhelming, aren't they? He was consistently noted as an average student.
Right. He wasn't blazing a trail as some kind of military genius or a tactical wonderkind. He was competent, but not extraordinary by any stretch of the imagination.
Yet later in his career, he went to these great lengths to establish himself as an intellectual authority within the armed forces. He focused on military geography and geopolitics.
Which is a classic move, really. It's an ambitious officer looking for an edge beyond the battlefield, a way to distinguish himself.
And this ambition drove him to publish two notable books. Geopolitica in 1968 and then Campaña de Tarapacá in 1972. They certainly cemented his reputation at the time.
They did, but what's truly revealing about his character, even at this early stage, is that this academic achievement was fundamentally dishonest.
I find that specific detail so fascinating because it sets an immediate pattern for his behavior. Later investigations showed that in his book Geopolitica, Pinochet plagiarized.
Extensively. He lifted paragraphs and ideas wholesale from his own mentor, General Gregorio Rodriguez Tascón, specifically from a conference presentation Tascón had given years before, back in 1949.
It just reveals this deep-seated tendency toward opportunistic deceit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. He wasn't relying on original scholarship. He was relying on the prestige and authority that came with appearing to be a military intellectual. This isn't just a footnote. It shows a man willing to co-opt and manipulate sources of authority for his own personal advancement.
A trait that will reappear, I think it's fair to say, much more violently later in his career.
Without a doubt.
And this brings us to that pivotal moment in August of 1973. The political climate in Chile was just in freefall.
Total chaos. And just one day after the Chamber of Deputies passed a resolution saying that President Salvador Allende's democratically elected socialist government was acting outside the Constitution.
What does Allende do? He appoints Pinochet as the commander-in-chief of the army.
That appointment is just extraordinary when you look back on it. Allende trusted Pinochet. He truly believed him to be a loyal institutionalist, precisely because Pinochet had cultivated this image of being a reserved, dedicated, apolitical military man.
So he seemed different from the more politically aggressive generals.
Exactly. Allende inadvertently placed the very man who would overthrow him at the highest military post, just weeks before the coup. A fatal error.
And that coup occurred just a few short weeks later, on September 11th, 1973.
It was a classic military coup d'etat. It was meticulously planned and executed by the combined armed forces. The image of the presidential palace, La Moneda, being shelled by ground forces and Hawker Hunter jets.
I mean, that is one of the most enduring and violent images of 20th century Latin American history. The takeover was brutal and it was fast.
And for decades, the controversy surrounding Allende's final moments just persisted. The military junta immediately claimed he had committed suicide inside the shelled palace.
A claim that was, initially dismissed by many of his supporters and critics of the regime. They insisted he was assassinated.
And that debate raged for years. But the Chilean Supreme Court ultimately confirmed the suicide theory in 2014 based on new forensic evidence and testimony. But, regardless of the manner of his death, the end result was the same.
The violent, unconstitutional overthrow of a democratic government.
Precisely.
And even among the coup plotters themselves, Pinochet's specific role it's murky. He later wrote a book, The Decisive Day, claiming he was the grand mastermind coordinating the entire scheme.
Oh, yes. He presented himself as the essential figure, the linchpin. But other key players tell a completely different story.
Like Air Force Commander Gustavo Lee.
Exactly. Lee, a key co-conspirator, claimed that Pinochet was actually reluctant, that he was wavering, and only joined the plot days before it was executed. He said Pinochet was primarily following the firm lead of the Navy, particularly Admiral Moreno.
So that ambiguity is central to understanding him. Was he the brilliant schemer he made himself out to be, or was he the ultimate opportunist who just waited until the momentum was irreversible before claiming leadership?
I think the evidence points much more strongly to the latter. He was an opportunist.
Because if he was so reluctant, why did he immediately move to seize absolute power after the coup? That seems to suggest he was just waiting for the optimal moment, right? Using his position of trust, rather than actually leading the charge from the beginning.
That's the analysis that fits the evidence much, much better. He played the long game. And in that long game, the support of the United States was absolutely indispensable.
Our sources are very clear on this. The U.S. favored the coup and provided significant financial and intelligence backing to the military leadership.
And we have to be clear, the U.S. intervention wasn't confined to the day of the coup. CIA covert actions had been actively working to destabilize Allende's government for 3 years prior.
3 years. That included imposing what was effectively an invisible blockade, right?
Yes, designed to starve the Chilean economy and create the exact conditions of social and economic crisis that would be needed to justify a military intervention.
So, after the coup, the junta immediately needs a narrative to sanitize their violence.
Of course. They released a Libro Blanco, the White Book, which claimed they were acting preemptively. They said they were stopping a self-coup, a supposed plot by Allende's associates called Plan Zeta.
And the sources indicate the U.S. intelligence agencies pretty quickly concluded this Plan Z was fabricated.
Right. They saw it for what it was. Propaganda created solely to legitimize the takeover and create this illusion of necessity. Though, to be balanced, some later insisted that elements of Plan Z did bear some similarities to pre-existing, though unexecuted, paramilitary plans of Allende's popular unity parties.
But the intent was clear. Sell the narrative that the military were saviors, not usurpers.
And initially, the junta was a 4-member body. It had the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Carabineros, the national police.
They suspended the Constitution and Congress, banned all political parties, and imposed strict censorship and a curfew. They were operating as both the executive and legislative branches.
The initial plan, though, was to rotate the presidency annually among the 4 commanders.
That never materialized, did it?
Not for a second. Pinochet consolidated power with astounding speed. By June of 1974, he was proclaimed the supreme chief of the nation by decree. 6 months later, he was officially president of the republic.
It just demonstrates his cunning. He systematically sidelined anyone who might challenge him.
Look at General Gustavo Ley, the Air Force commander we mentioned earlier. He contradicted Pinochet's hardening policies, and for that he was ultimately forced into retirement in 1978.
So Pinochet's grip on power became absolute and irreversible within the first 5 years of the dictatorship.
It did, and once that grip was absolute, he directed the military dictatorship toward the systematic elimination of all political opposition.
Okay, so let's turn to the chilling operational structure that made this possible. The repression was instantaneous and comprehensive. It transformed Chile into a deeply repressive state almost overnight.
The initial targets were clear. Communists, socialists, leftists, union leaders, academics, really anyone who was deemed a political critic. The sheer magnitude of the violence is best understood through the government's own accounting after the democratic transition.
Right, the Rettig and Valech reports, they document the scope, and the numbers they're just horrifying. They're difficult to process.
They are. At least 3,095 people were killed or forcibly disappeared during his rule.
And the count of torture victims, initially recorded at over 31,000, rose to approximately 40,018 by 2011. That's as follow-up commissions identified more victims who finally felt safe enough to testify.
And we also have to account for those who simply fled for their lives. An estimated 200,000 Chileans, which was roughly 2% of the entire 1973 population, were forced into political exile immediately following the coup and the subsequent purge.
2% of the whole country.
And hundreds of thousands more left later because of the economic upheaval. This was a national trauma that affected every single segment of society.
This level of systemic violence, it required a dedicated organization. And that was Pinochet's DIANA, the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional.
D9 was the primary engine of state terror. But it wasn't just a domestic secret police force. It was Pinochet's personal intelligence service. It was designed to neutralize opposition, both at home and abroad.
And it was under Pinochet's direct command that Operation Condor was formally established in late 1975.
Operation Condor represents a terrifying new level of state collaboration. This was a U.S.-supported cooperation plan among the intelligence agencies of multiple South American dictatorships. We're talking Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, and Bolivia.
And the goal was to hunt down and eliminate political exiles globally.
Exactly. The collective toll of this multinational terror plan is estimated at around 60,000 deaths across all the participating countries. It was primarily executed through cross-border kidnappings, assassinations, and disappearances. The operation was chillingly efficient.
And this brings us back to the complex and, deeply problematic role of the U.S. in supporting the junta. Declassified documents reveal the U.S. provided not just financial assistance,
but also organizational and technical support to the Chilean regime. They maintained active, paid contacts within DINA.
The head of DINA itself, Manuel Contreras, the man overseeing the systematic torture and murder of thousands, was a long-standing paid CIA asset.
And that is a crucial, shocking detail. The agency responsible for this horrific repression was directly collaborating with, and being paid by, U.S. intelligence. And this was with the full knowledge that some of their officers were involved in human rights abuses.
Focusing specifically on the methods used in Chile, the brutality started immediately after the coup. One of the first most notorious actions was the so-called Caravan of Death in October 1973.
This was essentially a traveling death squad. A group of military personnel moving by Puma helicopter traveled up and down the country, stopping at various garrisons to review political prisoners.
And they killed at least 70 people during this sweep, often with no semblance of legal process, sometimes executing prisoners right in front of their comrades.
It was pure terror, designed to send a clear message.
The regime also went to great lengths to target high-profile figures who could represent a political threat in exile. General Carlos Prats, who was Pinochet's predecessor as army commander.
He was assassinated by a car bomb in Buenos Aires in 1974.
And then 2 years later, in 1976, Orlando Letelier, who was the former ambassador to the U.S. and a former minister in Allende's cabinet.
He was murdered by a car bomb right in the middle of Washington, D.C. A bold, brazen act of international state terrorism.
Sources later alleged that the order for this specific mission, which was codenamed Operation Mascarada, came directly from Pinochet himself. It just demonstrates a regime that felt completely untouchable, operating with total impunity even on foreign soil.
The methods of torture that were used in detention centers like Villa Grimaldi, they're meticulously documented in the commission reports. They describe organized, systematic sadism. It was designed to dehumanize and destroy the individual.
The list of methods is it's sickening. Severe physical beatings with chains resulting in fatal internal injuries. The routine rape and sexual torture of female prisoners.
And specific psychological and physical abuse techniques. One horrifying example known as the telephone, where the torturer would strike both ears of the victim simultaneously with open hands, often causing permanent deafness.
At Villa Grimaldi, there are confirmed reports of prisoners deliberately being run over with trucks in the parking lot, just to crush their legs, purely as a form of cruelty and disposal.
And the ultimate disposal of the bodies was equally calculated to conceal the evidence. Bodies were often interred in secret graves or notoriously loaded onto helicopters for death flights.
Where they were just dumped into rivers or out into the ocean.
Yeah.
At least 120 bodies are confirmed to have been disposed of this way.
It's chilling when you realize the sheer logistical organization required to carry out violence at this scale and then to dispose of the evidence so systematically, and it gets even darker. The state terror even reached into chemical and biological warfare.
Right. DNA employed a biochemist named Eugenio Barrios. He ran a military laboratory.
And in that lab, Barrios produced highly dangerous agents. We're talking sarin gas, anthrax, botulism, all intended for use against opponents of the regime.
It just reflects a regime that was willing to utilize every available tool, from simple execution to sophisticated chemical terror, to guarantee its own survival and eliminate dissent.
It's a critical foundation to understand because this state of absolute fear was the necessary precondition for the next phase of the regime, the radical economic overhaul.
We've detailed the cost of the state terror, but it is so critical now to understand that this repression was not separate from the economic project. It was the foundation that allowed these radical, deeply unpopular reforms to be implemented without any democratic accountability.
That is the essential link. You cannot separate them. The Pinochet regime did not just replace a socialist government, it replaced a socialist economic model with a radical free market one. But we have to first establish the context. The economy under Allende was in severe distress.
Severe is an understatement. The nationalization of industries, coupled with massive price controls and that U.S. invisible blockade, had created absolute chaos. By 1973, inflation had reached an astronomical 606%.
606%. GDP had contracted by 5% that year, and public spending had ballooned to nearly 45% of GDP.
To put that 606% inflation figure into context for you, imagine trying to buy groceries today and knowing that by the time you get to the checkout, the prices have already shot up. Life for the average Chilean was defined by constant shortages, black markets,
and the swift evaporation of any savings or wages they had. The economy was functionally collapsing. It was a disaster.
Pinochet's regime tried some initial, more traditional Keynesian fixes, but by 1975, they decided on a radical shift. And this was influenced by a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys.
These were Chilean economists, many of whom had been trained at the University of Chicago under the influence of Milton Friedman. They strongly advocated for laissez-faire capitalism and minimal state intervention.
And Pinochet, embracing their vision, implemented what became known as shock therapy reforms. These were deeply unpopular, but politically feasible, thanks to the complete and total suppression of any opposition.
Pinochet's ambitious goal was very clear. He said he wanted to make Chile not a nation of proletarians, but a nation of proprietors.
And the reforms were rapid and sweeping.
The key policies included, first, stringent currency stabilization measures, then the dramatic reduction or elimination of tariff protections, which basically threw the country open to global competition, and critically, a total outright ban on trade unions.
Which dismantled the primary source of organized worker resistance to the reforms.
Exactly. And on top of that, they embarked on this extensive program of privatization, selling off hundreds of state-owned enterprises that had been nationalized under Allende.
Yet there was one major exception that reveals the continued pragmatism and maybe nationalism within the regime. Copper.
That's right. The nationalized copper mines were kept in government hands under the state-owned company Codelco, which was established in 1976. The 1980 Constitution even declared the copper reserves inalienable, ensuring that the government retained control over Chile's primary source of foreign revenue.
So beyond industry, the regime fundamentally restructured the social safety net, establishing this dual system across essential services.
Yes, the pension system, which had been a traditional pay-as-you-go public system, was completely overhauled. It was replaced with a fully funded private capitalization system managed by private pension funds known as AFPs.
So practically, this meant that the state was no longer responsible for funding future pensions. Workers had mandatory deposits into their own private investment accounts.
Correct. And a similar model was applied to healthcare, with the private ISAPREs alongside the state-run FNASA, and education was also partially privatized.
This is where the intense debate over Pinochet's economic legacy really begins. Proponents point to immediate, and I think you have to say undeniable successes. The economy recovered quickly, growing at an average of 7.2% annually between 1976 and 1981.
And furthermore, those proponents cite massive long-term reduction in poverty. It dropped from roughly 50% down to 7.8% by 2013, and a substantial rise in income per capita in the decades that followed. For those who prioritize growth and market liberalization above all else, the reforms are viewed as necessary and ultimately successful.
However, critics highlight the devastating immediate failures and the structural inequality that these policies cemented into place. The liberalization led directly to the severe monetary crisis of 1982, when the whole bubble just burst.
And that crisis was so profound that Pinochet's regime was forced to renationalize much of the private debt and intervene heavily to save the banking sector. They had to temporarily contradict their own free market ideology just to keep the country afloat.
Beyond the crisis, the policies came at a tremendous human cost. Critics emphasized that the working class bore the entire brunt of the shock therapy. Wages decreased by an average of 8%.
And budgets for essential public services, education, health, housing, they were slashed by over 20%.
The core issue, though, wasn't just poverty. It was the concentration of wealth. A 2020 study detailed how, during that privatization spree, many state firms were sold at below-market prices to politically connected individuals.
Pinochet's own son-in-law, Julio Ponce Lerou, benefited significantly from these sales. It really suggests the so-called free market experiment was riddled with cronyism and personal enrichment right from the outset.
The most damning statistic regarding the resultant structural inequality is just stark. By the late 1980s, the wealthiest 10% of the population saw their incomes rise by a staggering 83%.
While at the same time, approximately 45% of the general population had fallen into poverty. This extreme wealth imbalance, baked into the system by the dictatorship's policies, is the enduring legacy that continues to fuel social and political protests in Chile even today.
The economic model was now firmly established, but the political model had an expiration date, and it was one determined by Pinochet's own 1980 constitution. That document prescribed a single-candidate presidential referendum for 1988.
Yes, it was a plebiscite, a simple question for the country. Should Pinochet stay in power for another 8 years, yes or no?
By the mid-1980s, domestic opposition was mounting and international pressure was building. And a key external factor was the April 1987 visit of Pope John Paul II.
That visit was huge. The Pope, seeing the mounting violence and the lack of political freedom, allegedly pressured Pinochet directly for a democratic opening. Some reports say he even called for his resignation, effectively urging him to accept the plebiscite as a legitimate path to a transition of power.
So when the campaign finally began, the opposition coalesced under the banner of the No Coalition. And they ran this clever, very media-savvy campaign.
They used a cheerful, optimistic slogan that has become legendary, La alegría ya viene, joy is coming. It was brilliant. They contrasted their message of hope with the regime's grim, gray authoritarianism.
And the result was definitive, a clear rejection of the dictator. The no option won with 55.99% of the votes.
But this democratic process nearly failed at the very last moment.
That's right. Pinochet was completely unwilling to accept defeat. He attempted to implement an auto-coup, a self-coup, demanding extraordinary powers from the ruling junta to seize the capital and annul the vote.
But he was stopped by his own inner circle. Air Force General Fernando Maffei famously refused. He stated firmly that he would not support the move under any circumstances and that forced Pinochet to accept the referendum result.
Maffei was the first member to publicly concede Pinochet had lost. It was a pivotal moment that secured the transition.
So Pinochet stepped down as president in March 1990, transferring power to the democratically elected Patricio Aylwin. But this was not retirement, not by a long shot.
Not at all. He maintained immense power. He kept his role as commander-in-chief of the army until March of 1998.
And the very day he retired from that post, he automatically assumed the role of senator for life. This was a privilege granted to him by his own 1980 constitution, which crucially afforded him immunity from prosecution.
And that constitutional shield held fast until he left Chile and ended up in London for medical treatment later that same year.
What happened next is a landmark moment in international law. In October 1998, Pinochet was arrested in London under an international arrest warrant issued by a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón.
The charges were severe: genocide and terrorism that include murder.
And we'd really have to pause to consider why this was so revolutionary. It was the first time in history that a former head of government was arrested based on the principle of universal jurisdiction.
And that's the doctrine that certain crimes like genocide, torture, crimes against humanity are so egregious that they can be prosecuted anywhere in the world, right?
Exactly. Regardless of where they were committed or the nationality of the perpetrator or the victim. Judge Garzón utilized this principle to argue that the crimes committed under Pinochet's regime warranted global judicial intervention.
The ensuing legal battle spanned 2 years, and it just captured global attention. It featured intervention from major political figures like Margaret Thatcher, who lobbied for his release.
Ultimately, the UK Home Secretary Jack Straw released Pinochet in March of 2000, overruling a House of Lords decision to extradite him to Spain. The official reason was medical grounds.
The claim that Pinochet was too ill, supposedly suffering from vascular dementia, to be able to stand trial.
The cynicism of this ruling was just laid bare upon his return to Santiago. In this highly televised moment, after being wheeled off the plane, Pinochet dramatically rose from his wheelchair to greet his supporters.
And that gesture, which was intended to rally his base, it enraged human rights advocates and immediately cast doubt on the medical diagnosis that had just saved him from extradition.
And that visual provided a new legal opening. While the human rights cases had struggled to move forward because of his immunity and his claimed medical state, accountability eventually came from a completely different direction: the world of global finance.
This is where the narrative pivots so dramatically. In 2004, a U.S. Senate money laundering investigation, initially spurred by post-9/11 scrutiny of international financial flows, uncovered the sheer scale of Pinochet's secret wealth.
The investigation, spearheaded by Senators Levin and Coleman, revealed a really sophisticated network.
They found that Pinochet and his associates used this complex web of over 125 secret accounts at Riggs Bank and other U.S. financial institutions. They moved millions and millions of dollars over 25 years using alias names.
Most famously, Daniel Lopez.
And that alias immediately became a sarcastic nickname among his opponents, Daniel Lopez. The investigation determined that Pinochet had corruptly amassed at least $28 million.
And the sources traced the origins of this money primarily to kickbacks on arms deals that were negotiated while he was still Army chief between 1990 and 1998.
So we're talking about illegal, massive corruption involving state resources. The kickbacks included sales of French fighter jets, Dutch tanks, and the scandalous sale of illegal weapons to Croatia during the Balkans War, which was under a strict UN embargo at the time.
I mean, the irony is just profound. The man who claimed to have saved Chile from economic disintegration was systematically using his political position to enrich himself and his family through illegal arms trafficking and money laundering.
And these corruption charges, tax evasion, embezzlement, were eventually leveraged to indict him, his wife, and his children. His daughter, Lucia Pinochet, was even deported from the U.S. in 2006 for trying to evade the tax charges back in Chile.
Meanwhile, the human rights trials, which had been stalled for years, they finally started to move again. That dramatic wheelchair exit and a subsequent television interview Pinochet gave in 2004, where he appeared fully lucid and capable.
That led the Chilean Supreme Court to overturn the medical dementia ruling. He was declared fit to stand trial.
And consequently, he was charged with involvement in some of the regime's worst atrocities. We're talking the Caravan of Death, Operation Colombo, the kidnappings and tortures at Villa Grimaldi.
He was also implicated in the murder of that Dina Nabai biochemist, Eugenio Barrios, the man who produced chemical agents for Dina.
And disturbingly, sources suggest Barrios was murdered partly because he was linked to the production of something called black cocaine, which Pinochet allegedly sold in Europe and the U.S., depositing the proceeds directly into his secret bank accounts. It just further intertwines his state terror with his financial crimes.
Pinochet's story is just full of these deep geopolitical and ideological contradictions. Take, for instance, his relationship with the United Kingdom, the very country that eventually arrested him.
It's an essential, complex link. During the 1982 Falklands War between the UK and Argentina, Chile was officially neutral. But behind the scenes, the Pinochet regime secretly provided absolutely critical intelligence to the British task force.
They provided long-range radar surveillance. This gave the British early warnings of Argentinian air attacks. General Fernando Mathai, the same general who stopped the Otto coup, later noted this assistance was crucial to the British war effort.
And this covert assistance established a firm bond with the then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who always remained sympathetic to Pinochet.
This relationship is often cited as a key reason why Thatcher and other conservative figures lobbied so heavily for his release on medical grounds decades later when he was arraigned in London.
It became a major point of contention in British politics. It led Tony Blair to later mock the Conservatives as the party of Pinochet.
And ideologically, he's often lumped into the category of fascist, a term used by journalists like Samuel Chavkin to describe his brutal authoritarianism.
Right, but academics who specialize in political typologies, they generally exclude him from the strict definition of classical fascism.
And the reason for this exclusion is precisely that radical economic transformation we just discussed.
Exactly. Classical fascist regimes, you think of Mussolini or Hitler, they often prioritize a statist economy, national businesses, and this ideology of national rebirth. Pinochet's enthusiastic embrace of free market, neoliberal policies, and aggressive deregulation distinguishes his regime significantly from that typology.
So he was an authoritarian ultranationalist, but his ideology prioritized economic liberalization over traditional fascist economic control.
Then there's the profound contradiction of his personal image versus his reality. He carefully cultivated this image of a reserved, austere, common military man with simple ideas and a deep patriotic dedication.
But the reality, uncovered during the corruption investigations, was wildly different. It was revealed that Pinochet, this supposed man of austerity, had amassed a private library of more than 55,000 books.
Worth an estimated $2.84 million, all purchased using discretionary government funds.
55,000 books. That is the collection of a major university library, not a common man.
Not at all. And the contents are so telling. The collection was heavily dominated by military history and geopolitics, reflecting his core intellectual interests. It contained many rare, valuable volumes.
And curiously, almost no poetry or fiction.
Right. It suggests a man obsessed with power, strategy, and his own place in history, modeling himself after figures he admired, like Napoleon and Louis XIV, rather than the simple patriot he claimed to be.
This internal contradiction was not lost on his opponents. They gave him several distinct, evocative nicknames.
Supporters respectfully used the traditional salute, "Mi General." Opponents, referencing his denial of the coup's brutality and his constantly shifting narratives, they called him Pinocho Spanish for Pinocchio.
And of course, after the financial scandals broke, he was permanently sarcastically branded with his own alias, Daniel Lopez.
The long, controversial life of Augusto Pinochet finally ended in December of 2006.
He died on December 10, 2006, from a heart attack. And he had never been convicted on any of the nearly 300 criminal charges that were pending against him for human rights abuses, tax evasion, or embezzlement.
The legal process simply ran out of time.
Just 2 days before his death, in a statement read by his wife, he took full political responsibility for everything that was done, claiming the goal was making Chile greater and avoiding its disintegration.
The government's reaction to his death was very telling. President Michelle Bachelet, whose own father was imprisoned and tortured under the regime, she refused to grant him a state funeral.
Right, she only allowed a military funeral for a former commander-in-chief. Bachelet stated that attending a state funeral for him would be a violation of her conscience.
His death, predictably, resulted in massive, polarized demonstrations in the streets of Santiago. Opponents celebrated the end of his life, while his supporters grieved the loss of the man they credited with saving Chile.
And his body was immediately cremated, reportedly at his own request, to avoid vandalism of his tomb.
Which says a lot.
This deep dive has explored the sheer scale of the legacy Pinochet left behind. We've seen a ruler who weaponized state terror, relying on the DNA's and international cooperation via Operation Condor to suppress dissent, leading to thousands killed and tortured.
And at the same time, he used that very repression as a platform to execute one of the world's most dramatic experiments in market liberalization, the shock therapy of the Chicago Boys, which spurred initial growth but left Chile grappling with profound structural inequality that persists to this day.
And his post-dictatorship life provides such a critical case study in transitional justice. He was shielded for years by the constitutional privilege of being a senator for life, and he dodged extradition and prosecution on human rights grounds via claims of medical incapacity, highlighted by the cynicism of that whole wheelchair incident.
Yet the very financial opacity and globalized nature of wealth that he embraced ultimately led to his downfall. He was exposed and indicted not by the pursuit of justice for murder and torture.
But by international investigations into money laundering, kickbacks, and tax fraud.
It's a truly chilling and complex figure to grapple with. A dictator undone not by the severity of his crimes against humanity, but by simple, garden-variety financial corruption.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought to consider. Pinochet died without conviction for the systematic murder and torture of his own people. Yet the persistent application of the principle of universal jurisdiction and, completely unexpectedly, the rigorous investigation of global finance proved that the consequences of a dictator's actions, both humanitarian and financial, can follow them to the bitter end of their days.
So the question is, what happens to the truth and reconciliation process when justice for human rights is continually halted by technicalities, only for sheer financial corruption to finally provide the legal framework for an indictment? Does financial justice sometimes end up paving the road for historical truth when humanitarian justice fails?
Food for thought indeed. That's been our deep dive into the life and legacy of Augusto Pinochet. We hope you feel thoroughly well informed. Join us next time.